My name is Caleb Martin. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worn the same quiet labels: dependable husband, steady coworker, the guy who shows up early and leaves late without needing to be noticed for it. I'm not the kind of person people point at in a room and think, that's the one who'll change everything. If anything, I've spent years being underestimated in a very specific way, mistaken for someone who doesn't mind, because I don't make a scene. People often read silence as consent. They interpret calm as a lack of depth. They assume that if you're not loud, you're not affected. And I used to let them think that, partly because it made life smoother. I grew up believing that being easy to live with was a virtue, that if I kept the peace would keep me. This story isn't about a sudden betrayal or a dramatic reveal. It's about something slower, and in some ways more dangerous: the erosion that happens when small lies stack up, when resentment is ignored instead of named, and when two people slowly stop being honest with themselves. From the outside, our marriage looks stable. 10 years is a long time to share a home, a routine, and a future you keep promising to start once things calm down. We had the kind of relationship people described with words like solid and mature. No shouting matches, no public scandals, just life. But the truth is, the collapse didn't begin with a single event. It began with a pattern so small it felt harmless at first: a half-truth to avoid conflict, a missing detail because it doesn't matter, a quiet decision made without me and explained later as if I should understand. The first time, you excuse it. The second time, you adapt. By the fifth time, you realize you're not adapting, you're shrinking. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of how I went from being the stable one to being the one who finally acknowledged what stability was costing me. It's not revenge, it's not drama, it's not a victory lap. It's a record, an honest account of what happens when love is treated like it's indestructible, and when one person keeps giving the benefit of the doubt until there's nothing left to give. I'm telling it the way I wish someone had told me, calmly, clearly, without making anyone a cartoon villain. There are reasons people lie. There are reasons people stay. And there are reasons good marriages fail without either person ever meaning for it to happen. If you've ever felt yourself slowly disappearing inside a relationship without any single moment you can point to, have you ever wondered when it actually started? For most of my marriage, I was described with words that sounded like compliments but functioned more like boundaries. Steady, low maintenance, easy. I was the husband people trusted to handle things without needing reminders. The one who remembered due dates, fixed the leaking sink, showed up to family events on time, and never made anyone uncomfortable by asking for too much space. At work, I was reliable. At home, I was supportive. Among friends, I was the calm one. None of those were untrue, but none of them were complete either. They described what I provided, not who I was. When people talked about my wife and me, they framed us as balanced. She was expressive, intuitive, and quick with words. I was grounded, logical, steady. It sounded complimentary, like a design choice. What it really meant was that when there was tension, it was assumed I could absorb it. When decisions had to be made quickly, it was assumed I'd adjust. When emotions ran high, it was assumed I didn't have any of my own that needed attention. I didn't correct those assumptions, not because I agreed with them, but because correcting them felt unnecessary at the time. I had learned long before marriage that being the emotional anchor made people stay, that if you didn't rock the boat, you were valued for keeping it afloat. So that became my role. I was the one who said it's fine when plans changed at the last minute, the one who listened carefully while others vented, then responded with something practical and calm. I was the person people leaned on without ever asking whether I needed to lean back. And because I didn't complain, because I didn't dramatize my feelings, it never occurred to anyone that there might be a cost, including me. Inside the marriage, this translated into a specific kind of invisibility, not neglect, at least not the obvious kind. I wasn't ignored, I was included, but I was included as infrastructure, like electricity, noticed only when it stops working. My preferences were treated as flexible. My boundaries were assumed to be movable. If something needed to be decided quickly, my opinion would be summarized rather than consulted. "You don't mind, right?" became a question asked after the decision was already made. And I didn't mind until slowly I did. But even then, I didn't frame it that way. I told myself stories that made the discomfort easier to carry. "She's under a lot of stress. This isn't worth an argument. Relationships require compromise." All true, all incomplete. What people didn't see, and what I barely acknowledged myself, was how often I was translating disappointment into silence. How frequently I was choosing harmony over honesty, not out of wisdom, but out of habit. I wasn't afraid of conflict. I was afraid of becoming someone who complicated things. So I stayed predictable. Predictable men are rarely interrogated. Their silence is interpreted as agreement. Their patience is taken as permission. And because I didn't push back, the image of me as the stable one hardened into something fixed, something that no longer required checking in with. That's the version of me everyone thought they knew. The man who would always be there, always be reasonable, always understand. The man who didn't need much, didn't want much, and therefore wouldn't leave. What none of them considered, including my wife, was that stability without visibility isn't strength. It's erosion happening quietly over time. And erosion doesn't announce itself. It just keeps going until one day you realize the ground beneath you isn't as solid as everyone assumed. I can trace the beginning of the end to something so small that I didn't mark it as important at the time. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic pause. Just a sentence delivered casually as it had already passed an internal review and been approved without my input. It happened on a Tuesday evening, ordinary enough that I remember it clearly for that exact reason. Dinner was half cooked, the window was open, and the light in the kitchen had that yellow tone that makes everything feel temporarily safe. My wife mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had agreed to spend the weekend at her sister's place. A family thing. Already planned. She said it while reaching for a plate, not looking at me. I remember nodding. Reflex more than agreement. "What about the dinner we said we'd have with Mark and Elena?" I asked. My tone was neutral, curious, not confrontational. She paused just briefly, then said, "Oh, I told them you wouldn't mind rescheduling." That was it. That was the whole moment. No argument followed. I didn't push. She smiled, added something about how I'm always flexible, and the conversation moved on to something else. From the outside, nothing went wrong. If someone had been watching, they would have seen a healthy couple navigating logistics. But something shifted in me, not sharply, not painfully, more like a thin thread being pulled loose. It wasn't the rescheduling. It was the assumption. The quiet decision was made about me, not with me, and the confidence with which it was delivered. As if my agreement was a given, something she could safely promise on my behalf. I told myself it was nothing. Couples do this all the time. It saves effort. It avoids unnecessary back and forth. And I had, in the past, agreed to similar things. That was the logic I used to file it away under not worth mentioning. But I didn't forget it, because later that night, lying in bed, I realized something uncomfortable. If I had minded, I wouldn't have known how to say it without sounding unreasonable. The narrative was already set. Flexible husband, understanding partner. Saying no would have felt like breaking character. That's what made it a cut. Not the act itself, but the narrowing of my options. In the days that followed, I noticed how easily that moment blended into the fabric of our lives. No apology was offered because none was expected. No check-in followed because nothing was seen as missing. When Mark texted to reschedule, I replied politely, even though a small part of me wanted to explain, but couldn't quite articulate what had been taken. When I mentioned it casually to a friend later, he laughed. "That's marriage, man," he said. "Pick your battles." And I accepted that answer because it fit the story I'd been telling myself for years. That maturity meant letting small things go. That love wasn't about asserting yourself, it was about accommodating. What I didn't see then was how that logic trained people around me. Every time I let a small thing slide without naming it, I reinforced an image. Caleb doesn't mind. And once that image is established, it becomes efficient for others to rely on it. From that point on, decisions began arriving in a similar format. Already made, already justified, already softened with phrases like, "I figured you'd be okay with it," or "I knew you'd understand." And because I didn't want to be the person who suddenly needed explanations, I kept understanding. Each time I told myself it was isolated. Each time I said yes before checking in with myself. And each time a little more space was carved out where my voice should have been. The first small cut never bleeds. That's why it's dangerous. It teaches you that you can lose something without immediate consequence, and that makes the next loss easier to ignore. I didn't realize it then, but that moment in the kitchen set a precedent. Not just for how decisions would be made, but for how much of myself I would quietly trade for peace. And once you start doing that, the math changes in ways you don't notice until much later. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. No escalation, no confrontation, just repetition. And repetition has a way of turning exceptions into expectations. The decisions kept coming in the same shape, already formed, already explained, already padded with my presumed consent. Weekend plans adjusted without asking. Purchases made with the explanation ready afterward. Conversations I was meant to be part of were summarized for me later, like meeting notes I hadn't attended. Each instance, on its own, was defensible. None of them crossed a line loud enough to justify an argument. And that's how it worked. The absence of obvious wrongdoing made my discomfort feel illegitimate, like I was overreacting to something everyone else would consider normal. So I rationalized. I told myself that this was what partnership looked like after a decade together. That efficiency replaced consultation, that trust meant not needing to be involved in every choice. I leaned on those ideas because they allowed me to stay quiet without feeling weak. What I didn't notice was how rarely the pattern reversed. It was almost never my assumptions being made about her. I didn't commit her time without checking. I didn't speak for her in conversations she wasn't present for. When I wasn't sure, I asked. When I was sure, I still checked, because that's how I'd learned to be careful with people I loved. At first, I framed that as mutual respect. Later, I began to wonder if it was something else entirely. There were moments when the imbalance became visible, at least to me. Like the time we were at a small dinner with friends, and someone asked about a potential move we'd briefly discussed months earlier. Before I could answer, my wife jumped in. "We've pretty much decided to stay," she said confidently. I smiled, everyone nodded, the conversation moved on. But we hadn't decided. We'd talked, we'd floated ideas, we'd agreed to revisit it later. What she meant was that she had decided, and that my silence up to that point had been interpreted as alignment. I didn't correct her, not then, not afterward. Instead, I replayed the moment privately, wondering why it bothered me more than it should. Why a single sentence could land with such weight. And the answer slowly was that it wasn't a single sentence. It was confirmation of a pattern I'd been quietly participating in. By staying agreeable, I was teaching people how to treat my agreement. I began to notice how often I pre-edited my own reactions, how frequently I filtered out disappointment before it reached my face. I was no longer responding honestly in real time. I was managing impressions, making sure I stayed consistent with the version of me everyone expected. And the thing about doing that long enough is that it becomes automatic. You stop checking whether something aligns with you and start asking whether it will disrupt the image. There were days when I felt oddly detached from my own life, like I was watching decisions unfold from a slight distance. Present but not central. Included but not essential. Still, I told myself this was normal, that this was adulthood, That emotional restraint was maturity. I reminded myself of the stability we had, the history, the shared routines. I reminded myself that nothing was wrong enough to justify friction. That phrase, not wrong enough, became my internal boundary, and it kept moving. Because once you normalize being spoken for, it stops feeling like disrespect and starts feeling like logistics. Once you normalize your preferences being secondary, you stop noticing when they disappear entirely. The most subtle shift was how rarely anyone checked in with me emotionally. Not because they didn't care, but because I had trained them not to worry. I was the one who had it together, the one who didn't need reassurance, the one who would speak up if something mattered. Except I didn't. And over time, silence stopped being a response. It became a personality trait assigned to me, something others relied on, something I was expected to maintain. I wasn't being mistreated in a way that would make for a dramatic story. I was being edited out slowly. And because I participated in that editing, I felt complicit, unable to point to a clear offender without also pointing back at myself. That's how disrespect becomes invisible. Not through cruelty, but through convenience. Through patterns that no one questions because they benefit from them continuing. And I let them continue. Not because I didn't feel the loss, but because I believed naming it would cost more than staying quiet. At least that's what I told myself then. It took me a long time to realize that I wasn't just being treated a certain way, I was being cast. And like most roles that form quietly, it didn't come with a script I could reject. It came with expectations I was already fulfilling. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the person who absorbed uncertainty so others didn't have to. In group settings, this looked like competence. In the marriage, it looked like emotional labor that no one thought to name because it didn't create noise. When something went wrong, I handled it. When plans fell apart, I adjusted. When emotions ran high, I lowered my voice. Over time, these behaviors stopped being appreciated as choices and started being treated as defaults. That's the moment a role becomes a cage. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly. We were discussing a career opportunity my wife was considering, one that would require longer hours and more travel. She spoke about it with excitement, listing the benefits, the potential growth, and the timing. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "I know this will be a lot on you, but you're good at handling things." It wasn't said dismissively, it was said with confidence, trust even. And that's what made it complicated. Because she wasn't wrong. I was good at handling things. I had been for years. But the way she said it made it clear that the decision had already crossed an internal threshold. My role in the conversation wasn't to evaluate, it was to absorb the impact. I nodded, asked a few logistical questions, offered support. The conversation moved forward as planned. Later, alone, I sat with a discomfort that felt different from before. Not sharper, but clearer. It wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being defined by my usefulness rather than my agency. I started to see the pattern everywhere. In how family members called me when they needed help, but rarely asked how I was doing. In how friends assumed I'd be available because I usually was. In how my own needs were treated as optional add-ons, easily postponed. And I realized something unsettling. I had helped build this version of myself. By never pushing back, I had made myself predictable. By always being reasonable, I had made myself easy to plan around. And by avoiding conflict, I had made it possible for others to forget that I had limits at all. The role I was assigned wasn't villainous. It wasn't abusive. It was efficient. And efficiency has no incentive to question itself. What made it harder was that this role came with praise. People trusted me, relied on me, spoke well of me. From the outside, I looked like the ideal partner, the one who didn't create problems, who kept things running smoothly. So when I felt uneasy, I questioned myself instead of the structure. Maybe this is just what being dependable feels like. Maybe this is maturity. Maybe I'm expecting too much. But the quiet truth was that no one was asking me who I wanted to be in the relationship anymore. They were assuming I would continue being who I had always been. That's when I understood the danger of being consistently underestimated. Not underestimated in intelligence or capability, but underestimated in depth, in desire, in the capacity to change. People don't fear losing what they believe is fixed, and I had allowed myself to become fixed in their eyes. I didn't feel angry. I felt replaceable in a very specific way, like a function rather than a presence, necessary but not consulted. That realization didn't lead to a confrontation. It led to something quieter: observation. I began paying attention to how often my agreement was expected, how rarely it was sought, and how seamlessly my role allowed everything else to move forward without friction. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for years. If this is who I'm expected to be, what happens if I stop playing the part? I didn't answer it yet, but I stopped pretending it didn't matter. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't come from a discovery or a confession. It happened in a moment so quiet that at first I almost dismissed it as fatigue. It was a Saturday morning. No plans, no urgency. The kind of morning we used to talk about years earlier when we imagined what having time would feel like. I was sitting at the small table near the window, drinking coffee that had already gone cold, scrolling through nothing in particular. My wife was in the other room, on a call. Her voice carried, animated, confident, familiar in a way that felt slightly distant. I wasn't listening closely, but certain phrases drifted through. Schedules, commitments. We've decided. That works for us. Again, that word. I waited for my name to come up, not because it needed to, but because I noticed I was waiting, as if some part of me still expected to be referenced, acknowledged, included. It didn't happen. She ended the call, cheerful, energized, told me about a new plan she'd agreed to, another weekend accounted for, another adjustment made. She spoke as if she were updating me on the weather. Informational, efficient, and something inside me went still. Not angry, not hurt, just clear. I realized in that moment that my presence had become assumed rather than engaged with, that my agreement was no longer something people waited for. It was something they relied on being automatic. What changed wasn't my opinion about her. It was my understanding of myself. I saw how often I had been quiet, not because I didn't care, but because caring felt inconvenient. How I had trained myself to be low friction. How much of my internal life had been filtered out before it ever reached the surface. And I understood something else too. If I spoke up now, it would sound sudden, out of character, disruptive. The longer I stayed silent, the more surprising my voice would become. That realization didn't make me want to speak louder. It made me want to listen differently. I didn't respond right away. I nodded, said, "Okay," watched her move on to the next thing. But internally, a line had been crossed, not by her, but by me. I stopped asking whether something was worth bringing up and started asking whether staying quiet was costing me more than I admitted. I replayed the last few years not as isolated moments, but as a pattern, one where I was consistently present but increasingly absent from decisions that shaped my life. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had previously rejected as disloyal. This doesn't have to continue. That thought didn't come with urgency. It came with relief. Because it wasn't about leaving. Not yet. It was about reclaiming the right to notice myself, to stop dissolving into the background of my own marriage. I didn't confront her. I didn't make a list of grievances. I didn't demand change. I simply stopped automatically agreeing. That's the part no one noticed at first. I began pausing before responding, asking for time, saying, "Let me think about that," instead of "sure." The changes were subtle, almost imperceptible, but they were intentional. And something interesting happened. The more I slowed my responses, the more space I felt internally. Not because anything external had improved, but because I was no longer abandoning myself in the name of ease. That morning at the table, with cold coffee and filtered sunlight, I understood that the quiet erosion wasn't inevitable. It was optional, but only if I was willing to tolerate the discomfort of changing how I showed up. I didn't know where that shift would lead. I didn't know what it would cost. But I knew one thing with certainty. Continuing exactly as I had been was no longer an option I could live with. Not because of anger, because of clarity. After that morning, my silence changed its texture. Before, it had been reflexive, an automatic smoothing over of edges before they could catch. Now, it has become deliberate. Not performative, not cold, just intentional. I stopped filling gaps out of habit. I stopped rescuing conversations from discomfort, and I stopped offering clarity before it was asked for. From the outside, nothing looked different. That was the interesting part. I still showed up, still handled my responsibilities, still listened, still spoke when necessary, but internally, the equation had shifted. Silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I chose, carefully, with awareness of what it protected. At first, people mistook the change for fatigue. "You okay?" someone asked once casually. "Yeah," I said, and it was true. I was better than okay. I was present in a way I hadn't been in years. What they didn't realize was that I had stopped buffering their expectations. When a plan was proposed, I didn't immediately agree. When an assumption was made, I didn't rush to confirm it. I let pauses exist, let questions hang unanswered for a moment longer than was comfortable. That pause did something subtle to the dynamic. People began explaining themselves more. Not defensively, just thoroughly. As if my silence had created a small vacuum they felt compelled to fill. They offered reasons where before they offered conclusions. They checked details they previously glossed over. And still no one asked outright what had changed. Because from their perspective, I was still being easy. Still calm, still not making demands. They interpreted my restraint as continued flexibility, not realizing it was now paired with attention. This is what people misunderstand about silence. When it's chosen consciously, it sharpens perception. You hear what's being said and what's not. You notice patterns because you're no longer busy managing reactions. I began noticing how often my wife spoke in terms of outcomes rather than processes. How frequently she updated me instead of involving me. How rarely she asked for my input, unless it affected logistics she didn't want to handle alone. None of this was new. What was new was that I was no longer translating it into excuses on her behalf. I didn't tell myself she was stressed, or busy, or unaware. I simply observed, and I started documenting, not in a dramatic way, not with accusations, but with facts, dates, decisions, language. I wrote them down in the same worn notebook I'd carried for years. Not because I planned to use them against anyone, but because I wanted to stop gaslighting myself. Patterns are harder to dismiss when they're written plainly. What surprised me most was how comfortable others were with my silence when it continued to serve them. No one asked if I was withdrawing. No one checked whether something was wrong. As long as I remained functional, my interior life remained optional. That realization didn't hurt the way earlier ones had. It confirmed something I had already begun to accept. People respond to the version of you that benefits them most. And for years I had been that version. Now, my silence had a boundary. It was no longer agreed by default. It was a placeholder, waiting to see what others would reveal when I didn't rush to reassure them. I didn't correct misunderstandings immediately. I let assumptions play out. Not to trap anyone, but to see whether they would notice the absence of my confirmation. Most didn't. And that told me everything I needed to know about how replaceable my voice had become in the system we'd built together. Silence, when misunderstood, is seen as weakness, passivity, compliance. But silence, when chosen, becomes leverage, not over others, but over yourself. It gives you time, perspective, the ability to decide rather than react. I wasn't plotting anything yet. I wasn't preparing an exit. I was recalibrating. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to be easy to live with. I was trying to be honest with myself first, and that made all the difference. What people rarely understand about quiet people is that silence doesn't mean stillness. While nothing appeared to be changing on the surface, something very methodical was happening underneath. I began preparing, not for confrontation, not for escape, but for clarity. The notebook I had carried for years stopped being a place for scattered thoughts and started becoming a record. I wrote without commentary, no emotion, just facts. Dates when decisions were made without me. Phrases that kept repeating, shifts in tone, promises deferred. I asked, but I never received real answers. Not to build a case. To see the truth without distortion. When things hurt, the mind looks for shortcuts. Stories that soften edges, interpretations that preserve attachment. Writing stripped that away. Patterns became visible in a way memory alone never allows. I noticed how often we meant she, how frequently my agreement was assumed, but my dissent required justification. How discussions only became collaborative when the outcome was uncertain, not when it was already decided. None of this was explosive. That was the unsettling part. If someone had asked me, "Are you being mistreated?" I wouldn't have known how to answer. There were no insults, no threats, no obvious cruelty, just a steady, almost invisible narrowing of space where my agency used to be. At the same time, I started learning quietly. I read about communication patterns, not from self-help books, but from legal and psychological frameworks. Power dynamics, consent erosion. The difference between accommodation and agreement. I wasn't trying to diagnose anyone. I was trying to name what I was experiencing in language that didn't rely on emotion alone. Because emotion can be dismissed, patterns can't. I also began paying closer attention to finances. Not because anything felt wrong, but because I realized how little visibility I actually had into decisions that affected our shared future. Accounts I rarely checked, subscriptions I hadn't approved, expenses justified after the fact. Again, nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. Just asymmetry. And asymmetry only matters once you stop pretending it's balanced. What no one noticed during this time was how much I was stepping back internally. I still participated, still smiled, still followed through, but I was no longer anchoring my identity to being needed. That shift changes how you move. I stopped volunteering extra effort where it wasn't reciprocated. I stopped smoothing over awkward moments. I stopped reminding people of things that weren't my responsibility, and I watched what happened when the system lost its silent stabilizer. Small delays, minor confusion, nothing catastrophic, but enough to reveal how much unseen labor I'd been providing. No one connected it to me. They chalked it up to busyness, to timing, to bad luck. And that, too, was information. The most important thing I prepared wasn't logistical. It was emotional independence. I practiced imagining outcomes without immediately calculating how they would affect others. I let myself consider futures where I wasn't constantly adjusting my shape to fit someone else's expectations. At first, that felt selfish, unfamiliar. Then it felt necessary. I noticed how differently conversations landed when I wasn't silently negotiating my response in advance. How much lighter I felt when I didn't rush to resolve tension that wasn't mine to fix. People around me interpreted this as continued calm. They didn't see the internal line being drawn. What they never noticed was that I had stopped trying to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I no longer needed acknowledgement to validate what I was seeing. Clarity had replaced hope, and clarity is dangerous, not because it leads to revenge, but because it removes denial. By the time anyone sensed something was off, the groundwork was already laid, not for drama, for inevitability. Because once you truly see the structure you're standing in, you can't unsee whether it was built to include you or simply use you. And I had finally answered that question. Quietly, completely. The reveal didn't arrive like a shock. It came like a confirmation, quiet, precise, and strangely unemotional. By the time I understood what I was looking at, I had already suspected it for a while. It happened late one evening, after my wife had gone to bed. I was sitting at the desk in the spare room, the one that had slowly become more mine than ours. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't searching for betrayal. I was reconciling documents, something I had started doing routinely once I realized how many decisions were being made without my awareness. Bank statements, calendars, email confirmations, nothing hidden, nothing locked, just information that had never been brought into the same room before. And when it finally was, a pattern emerged that I could no longer soften. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't a secret life. It was something more mundane and more revealing, a consistent habit of pre-commitment. Financial choices were made in anticipation of my agreement. Time commitments were booked under the assumption of my availability. Long-term plans were sketched out with my role already defined, but never discussed. I saw it clearly then. I wasn't being deceived. I was being managed. Not maliciously, not consciously perhaps, but systematically. The realization didn't trigger anger. It triggered relief. Because confusion evaporates when the picture finally makes sense. All those moments where I felt vaguely off balance now had a structure. This wasn't about trust being broken, it was about consent being bypassed. And once I named that, everything recalibrated. I didn't confront her. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't test her reactions. I didn't need to. The purpose of the reveal wasn't to create a moment, it was to end my uncertainty. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Alignment. My internal signals finally matched the external evidence. There was no longer a need to reinterpret or excuse. The leverage wasn't a secret or a threat, it was understanding. I understood how decisions were being made. I understood how my silence had been incorporated into those decisions as a fixed variable. I understood how unlikely it was that this dynamic would correct itself without disruption. And I understood that disruption didn't have to be loud. From that night on, my choices became simpler. Not easier, but clearer. I stopped asking myself, how do I make this work without upsetting anyone? And started asking, what do I actually consent to? Those are very different questions. I also recognized something uncomfortable. If I raised concerns now, after years of quiet, it would be framed as sudden or unfair. The narrative would shift to, why didn't you say something sooner? And they wouldn't be wrong. But they also wouldn't be complete, because when a system rewards your silence, speaking up feels like betrayal, not honesty. And I had finally stopped protecting a system that didn't protect me. The private reveal wasn't about catching anyone in wrongdoing. It was about releasing myself from the obligation to doubt my own experience. That night, I wrote a single sentence in the notebook. Clarity removes the need for permission. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, grounded, prepared. Prepared not for revenge, but for inevitability. Because once you understand the true nature of your position in someone else's life, you don't need to announce your next move. You just need to make it. Clarity narrows your options. That's something no one really tells you. People talk about seeing the truth as if it opens doors, as if it gives you freedom in every direction. In reality, it does the opposite. It closes off the paths that were only survivable because you were half blind. Once I understood what I was consenting to by staying quiet, I couldn't unknow it. And from that moment on, every choice I made had weight. I didn't rush anything. Urgency would have been a betrayal of the work I'd already done. Instead, I let myself sit at the decision point longer than was comfortable, examining each option without romanticizing it. Option 1 was to speak up fully, lay everything out, explain the patterns, the erosion, the way my silence had been misread as consent, ask for change, negotiate a new dynamic. I imagined that conversation carefully, not the words. Those were easy. The aftermath was harder to picture, the defensiveness, the explanations, the promises to do better. The sudden attention arrives only once withdrawal becomes visible. I didn't doubt her ability to respond emotionally. I doubted the system's ability to change. Because this dynamic hadn't formed overnight. It had been reinforced for years by both of us. Undoing it would require sustained discomfort, not just insight. And I wasn't convinced that discomfort would be tolerated once the immediate threat passed. Option 2 was to stay. to accept the role fully, stop pretending I needed more, and reorganize my expectations accordingly. There was a strange peace in that option: predictability, stability, a known shape. But it required one thing I no longer had: self-erasure without resentment. I knew myself well enough by then to understand that choosing that path wouldn't make me kinder. It would make me smaller, and eventually quieter in a way that wasn't strategic but hollow. Option 3 was to leave. Not impulsively, not dramatically, not as a punishment, as a recognition. This option didn't come with fantasies of freedom or happiness. It came with loss, complications, disappointment, hers, mine, everyone's. It came with being misunderstood, with people revising the story to make sense of something I had never explained out loud. It also came with integrity. The irreversible part wasn't the act of leaving. It was the internal commitment to stop participating in a dynamic that required me to disappear. Once I named that, the decision made itself, not emotionally, logically. I realized that staying and asking for change would still keep me in a position where my needs had to be argued into legitimacy, where my clarity would be treated as a phase, where my silence would always be remembered more clearly than my words. Leaving didn't mean she was wrong or I was right. It meant the structure we had built no longer had room for the person I had become. I didn't tell anyone yet. Not friends, not family, not her. I marked the decision privately first, because that's where it had to be real before it could be visible. I wrote it down, not as a declaration, but as a boundary. I will not spend the rest of my life explaining why I need to exist fully. After that, everything else became logistics. There was grief, of course. Quiet grief. The kind that doesn't demand expression but settles into the body slowly. The kind that acknowledges what was real without pretending it was enough. But there was no panic. The decision point didn't feel like a cliff. It felt like standing still after years of adjusting my balance on uneven ground. For the first time, I wasn't choosing based on how things looked. I was choosing based on what they were. And once that choice was made internally, the next steps didn't require courage. They required patience. Once the decision was made, the noise in my head disappeared. That surprised me. I had expected anxiety, second-guessing, maybe even a surge of emotion demanding release. Instead, what arrived was a calm focus, the kind that usually follows acceptance, not conflict. I didn't announce anything. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't drop hints. I moved quietly, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the fact that this phase wasn't about being seen. It was about alignment between thought and action, and alignment doesn't require witnesses. I started with structure. I consulted a lawyer, not dramatically, not urgently, just to understand the terrain, to know what options existed, what timelines looked like, and what fairness actually meant when translated into process. I asked practical questions, took notes, left without making any commitments. Information first, always. Then finances. I separated clarity from suspicion. I mapped assets, accounts, and obligations. I ensured transparency, not to accuse, but to prepare. I made copies of documents I was already entitled to, updated passwords, opened an account in my own name. None of it disrupted our day-to-day life. That was intentional. At home, I remained exactly who I had been on the surface: polite, present, predictable. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance that would invite questions. I didn't want the decision to become a reaction to emotional turbulence. I wanted it to stand on its own. What's strange is how little resistance there was from the world around me during this phase, because from the outside, nothing had changed. My silence still looked like compliance. My calm still looked like stability. That's the danger of being underestimated for so long. People don't notice when you stop needing their approval. I also began preparing internally for the consequences I couldn't control. The way friends would ask questions, the way the family would look for reasons, the way my wife would replay moments, searching for a turning point she could recognize. I accepted that I wouldn't be able to offer one, because the truth was that nothing had happened recently. What had been happening for years. That kind of explanation doesn't land easily, So I stopped trying to craft one that would satisfy everyone. I focused instead on being able to live with myself. There were moments, small ones, when I wondered if I was being unfair by not speaking sooner, by not offering a chance for things to change once I had clarity. But I answered that honestly, too. I had been offering chances for years, just not loudly. And there is a difference between withholding information and choosing not to re-enter a negotiation you already know the outcome of. I wasn't moving toward separation with bitterness. I was moving toward congruence, toward a life where my participation was explicit, not assumed. The irony is that the quieter I became about my intentions, the more grounded I felt in them. There was no performance to maintain, no image to protect. I slept better, thought more clearly, stopped bracing for conversations that never came. Because once you stop waiting for permission to prioritize your own presence, the fear of being misunderstood loses its power. The final steps weren't dramatic either, just checklists, timelines, patience. By the time anyone would notice something was happening, the decisions would already be made, not out of coldness, but out of respect for the reality that clarity doesn't need an audience. I wasn't disappearing. I was repositioning myself in my own life. And when the consequences arrived, they wouldn't arrive as a shock to me, only to everyone else. The first consequences didn't look like consequences. They looked like an inconvenience. Small disruptions, missed expectations, moments where something that used to just work suddenly didn't. And because no one traced those shifts back to me, they were treated as anomalies rather than signals. The first sign was scheduling. A weekend plan overlapped unexpectedly. A commitment conflicted with another. In the past, I would have absorbed it, rearranged my time, smoothed the edges, found a solution that required no discussion. This time I didn't. I can't, I said simply. No explanation, no apology, just the truth. The reaction was mild confusion, a raised eyebrow, a pause. "Oh, okay," she said after a moment. We'll figure something out. And they did, just not as efficiently. Next came logistics. Things I used to handle without prompting, appointments, paperwork, follow-ups, started requiring attention from others. Questions arose that hadn't been asked in years. Systems that had relied on my quiet maintenance began showing wear. Still, no one asked what had changed. They assumed circumstances, stress, timing, life. At home, my wife began noticing gaps. Not emotional ones, but functional ones. Tasks left unanticipated. Details not pre-managed. I wasn't refusing to help. I was simply no longer preempting needs that weren't discussed. That distinction matters. Because when you stop doing invisible labor, people don't feel betrayed. They feel inconvenienced. And inconvenience is often the first emotion that surfaces when entitlement goes unexamined. Conversations shifted subtly. "Didn't you usually handle this? I thought you were taking care of that." "Oh, I assumed," I responded evenly. "I didn't know you needed me to." No defensiveness, no edge, just clarity. And slowly, attention entered the space, not because I was being difficult, but because the system had lost its silent stabilizer, the one who anticipated, absorbed, adjusted. The loss was felt before it was understood. Emotionally, there were changes too, but they were quieter. My wife began checking in more often, though not yet asking the right questions. She seemed unsettled, not threatened, confused by a shift she couldn't name. She hadn't noticed the years of accommodation. She noticed its absence. That's often how it happens. People don't miss your presence. They miss your function. And that realization, while painful, was clarifying. Friends noticed too. Invitations came with more questions. Expectations were no longer assumed. My availability became something that had to be confirmed. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions retroactively. I didn't point out how things used to be. I let the new reality establish itself without commentary. Because explanation would have softened the impact, and the impact was necessary. Not to punish, to reveal. There's a strange grief that comes with watching people adjust to your boundaries when they never noticed you didn't have any. It's not satisfaction. It's a quiet mourning for how conditional your ease had been. At the same time, I felt lighter. Not because things were easier, but because they were honest. The consequences continued to unfold, each one small enough to dismiss, but together forming a pattern that couldn't be ignored forever. Friction accumulated, questions formed, the atmosphere shifted. Still no confrontation, because the real consequence wasn't conflict, it was awareness. And awareness, once it starts, doesn't reverse. By the time the concern became visible, the window for repair had already closed. That's the part people struggle with most. The idea that nothing final happened to cause the ending. No single argument, no betrayal that could be isolated, apologized for, and patched over. Just a gradual realization that something essential had been missing for too long. The first real sign of panic came disguised as curiosity. "Have I done something wrong?" my wife asked one evening, casually but not casually enough. It wasn't an accusation, it was a test. I paused before answering, not to calculate, but because the question itself revealed how differently we were standing in the situation. She was looking for a recent cause. I was standing in a long-term effect. "I don't think it's about something you did," I said carefully. And that was true. She frowned, unsettled. "You just seem distant." I considered correcting that, explaining that I wasn't distant. I was present, just no longer overextended. That I was exactly as engaged as I had always been, minus the silent compensation. But I didn't say any of that, because at this stage, explanation would have sounded like negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating my right to be fully included. What followed over the next few weeks was a familiar arc. Increased attentiveness, more questions, a renewed effort to check in, suggestions for counseling, offers to slow down, to reevaluate plans. All of it sincere. All of it is too late. Not because change was impossible, but because the change being offered was reactive, not foundational. It addressed symptoms, not structure. The attention I was receiving now felt unfamiliar, not because it was unwelcome, but because it came from fear of loss rather than recognition of absence. And those two things are not the same. I didn't reject her efforts. I acknowledged them, listened, appreciated the care behind them. But internally, the decision had already passed its point of reversal. Once you stop hoping someone will finally see you without being prompted, it's very difficult to restart that hope on command. She asked what I needed. That question came years too late, because the honest answer wasn't a list. It was a history. And histories can't be fixed with adjustments. They require redefinition. I could see her trying to locate the moment things shifted, searching recent weeks for a trigger she could address. I could see the confusion, the self-doubt, the desire to do something. And I felt compassion. But compassion doesn't undo clarity. I explained gently that this wasn't about one issue, that I wasn't angry, that I didn't feel wronged in a way that required repair, that something in me had simply stopped negotiating. That answer didn't land well, because it offered no leverage, no problem to solve, no behavior to correct, just a reality to accept. People are often prepared to fix mistakes. They're rarely prepared to confront patterns that benefited them. The harder truth was this: if we had these conversations years earlier, they might have mattered. If she had noticed my absence before it became internalized, it might have been different. But once I stopped disappearing, I couldn't go back to pretending that reappearing was enough. That's what made it too late. Not malice, not neglect, timing. And timing, unlike intention, doesn't negotiate. The conversation people imagine as a confrontation rarely looks the way they expect. There was no raised voice, no listing of grievances, no moment where one of us broke down and said the perfect sentence that explained everything. It happened on an ordinary evening, no special timing, no dramatic lead-in. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where years earlier I had nodded through decisions already made. The light was soft, the house was quiet, and for the first time in a long while, there was no urgency in me. That absence of urgency changed everything. She spoke first, asked directly whether I was unhappy, whether I was thinking about leaving. Her voice was controlled, but I could hear the effort behind it. I didn't rush to reassure her. "I've already decided," I said calmly. Not as a threat, not as an announcement, as a fact. There was a long pause after that. Not the dramatic kind, just the kind where reality begins to reorganize itself in the room. She asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. Why hadn't I fought harder? Why hadn't I demanded change? I answered honestly. Because I was always adjusting, I said, and at some point I realized that adjusting was the relationship. That landed differently than an accusation would have. There was no villain in it, no claim of wrongdoing, just a description of a system that had worked until it didn't. She tried to explain, to contextualize, to apologize. I listened. That mattered to me. Not because it would change the outcome, but because respect doesn't disappear just because clarity arrives. But I didn't counter. I didn't debate timelines or intentions. I didn't argue about fairness. I explained one thing very clearly. I don't want to be negotiated back into visibility. That was the sentence that everything turned on. Because it wasn't about effort going forward, it was about how much had already been lost while effort was assumed unnecessary. There was no emotional explosion, no dramatic exit, just the quiet recognition that this conversation wasn't a beginning, it was a closure. She asked if there was anything that could change my mind. I shook my head, not coldly, gently, because certainty doesn't need volume. We sat with that for a while. The grief was there, but it was contained, processed, not chaotic. That's what happens when decisions are made slowly, privately, and with integrity. By the time they're spoken aloud, they don't need defense. The confrontation ended without hostility, without blame. Just an understanding that something had run its course. Not because it was broken, but because it had become too narrow to hold both of us honestly. And when I stood up from the table, I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. The period after the decision was quieter than I expected. Not emptier, just quieter, in a way that felt intentional. There was no rush to redefine myself, no urge to replace what had ended with something new. I didn't need reinvention. I needed integration. For a long time, I had defined myself by how well I fit into other people's lives, how useful I was, how little friction I caused. That version of me wasn't false, but it was incomplete. And now that the role had ended, I could finally see the shape of myself without it. I noticed how differently I moved through the world when my presence wasn't assumed. How conversations changed when I didn't pre-edit my thoughts. How much energy returned when I stopped monitoring the emotional temperature of every room I entered. I was still calm, still measured, still quiet. But now my quiet had edges. I said no without apologizing. I asked questions without softening them. I made plans that didn't require justification, not out of defiance, but out of alignment. The most surprising change wasn't external. It was internal trust. For years, I had second-guessed my own reactions, wondered whether I was being too sensitive, too rigid, too demanding. I had learned to doubt my discomfort before I ever named it. That doubt is gone now, not replaced by certainty in all things, but by respect for my own signals. If something feels off, I listen. If something matters, I say so early, not loudly, just clearly. People respond differently to me now. Some are taken aback at first. They expected the version of me that would absorb, adjust, and accommodate. Others adapt quickly, relieved, almost grateful to interact with someone who doesn't disappear mid-conversation. A few drift away. That used to frighten me. It doesn't anymore. Because I understand now that being consistently agreeable is not the same as being consistently present, and presence, real presence, requires boundaries. I don't carry bitterness about the marriage ending. I don't tell the story as a cautionary tale with a villain. I tell it as a record of what happens when two good people build something efficient instead of something reciprocal. I learned that love can exist without mutual visibility, and that's not enough. That stability without consent becomes confinement. That silence can protect peace, but it can also erode selfhood if it's never chosen consciously. Most of all, I learned that quiet people don't need to become loud to become powerful. They need to become clear. Clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't explain itself endlessly. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply stands. That's who I am now. Not someone hardened by loss. Not someone defined by what ended. Someone who no longer trades presents for approval. Someone who understands that being underestimated is only dangerous when you start believing it yourself. And I don't anymore. There's a version of this story that could have been told with anger, with blame, with a clean narrative arc where someone is clearly at fault and someone else is clearly wronged. But that wouldn't have been honest, and honesty is the only reason this story matters. Our marriage didn't collapse because of a single betrayal or a dramatic failure. It collapsed because of small lies and ignored resentment, not the kind spoken aloud, but the kind we tell ourselves. Lies like this aren't worth mentioning, or this is just how relationships work, or being patient is the same as being respected. They feel harmless in the moment, responsible even, until one day you realize those small concessions have quietly rewritten your role in your own life. The most dangerous part isn't being misunderstood by others, it's learning to misunderstand yourself, to translate discomfort into tolerance, to confuse flexibility with consent, to believe that if you're needed, you're valued, without checking whether you're actually seen. I don't regret loving deeply. I don't regret staying as long as I did. I regret only one thing, not recognizing sooner that silence, when it's never chosen, becomes a slow form of self-erasure. This isn't a warning against compromise. Compromise is essential, but it has to move in both directions. When one person keeps adjusting while the other keeps assuming, the relationship may look calm, but it's quietly collapsing. If there's a moral here, it's not leave sooner or speak louder. It's this. Pay attention to patterns before they harden into structures. Name discomfort while it's still specific. And never confuse being easy to live with being fully included. You don't need a dramatic reason to choose yourself. You don't need permission to notice that something essential has gone missing. And you don't owe anyone an explanation that requires you to disappear again in the telling. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt yourself becoming quieter in ways that didn't feel like peace, I'd like to hear from you. At what point do you think silence stops being patience and starts becoming a warning?
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.